Countries across the world risk facing massive bankruptcies and economic damage. That's if fiscal and monetary support deployed to support their economies through the current pandemic is removed too soon. These are the views of the International Monetary Fund's Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, who says that she does not see an exit from the current crisis next year. She says that the debt service suspension for poor countries must also be continued. Yesterday, the IMF's board approved a relief from debt payments to the fund for 28 countries for another 6 months. And the shifts and those payments to a special catastrophe relief fund provided by wealthier member countries. The IMF says that relief on debt service will free up scarce financial resources for vital emergency medical and other relief efforts, whilst these members combat the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in their countries. Well, not everyone agrees with the IMF's policies and advice when it comes to dealing with the current COVID-19 crisis. More than 500 organizations, including Human Rights Watch, have made a call to the IMF to immediately stop promoting austerity around the world. They want the global lender to instead advocate policies that reduce inequality and decisively put people and planet first. For more on this, I'm now joined via Zoom from New York by Human Rights Watch Sarah Saadoun. Sarah, thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so this pandemic's been with us plus 6 months, and global institutions like the IMF have stepped in partly to relieve countries from debt and also injecting funds directly into some of these countries. How well do you think the IMF has done in the past 6 months?
So first, I'd like to put a little nuance on what you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
We actually think that a lot of the rhetoric coming from the IMF, including what you were just discussing from the managing director, is exactly on point. But what we are alarmed is that the programs are actually telling a different story. So the IMF has already lent $90 billion to over 80 countries, and they've committed to use up to $1 trillion of their reserves to help countries dealing with the aftermath of this pandemic. Now, that money has tremendous potential to help people who are struggling to put food on the table, keep a roof on their heads, to ensure that education and health systems, social protection systems, which have been so affected by the pandemic, remain strong. But to do that, two things are needed. The first is that the public needs to be able to meaningfully and safely track how their governments are using these funds and hold officials accountable for any misuse. The second is that the IMF should not put any conditionalities on these funds that would essentially require, after an initial period of ramping up spending, for governments to essentially oppose austerity and shrink their budgets that are so essential for protecting rights.
All right, let's talk about those two things separately. Let's start with the first, because that's a big concern for me, actually, where either funds are given or debt relief is given, and therefore more funds are available in those countries. The people in many countries on the continent, they can't hold their governments accountable. Could it be institutions like the IMF might step in on their behalf and say, look, for this money, we need some accountability?
Yes, that's exactly what we've been pushing the IMF to do for months now. Now, the thing is that the instrument that they've been using for the past 6 months is an emergency instrument that's meant to get money out the door quickly. And so it doesn't have traditional IMF conditionalities, but governments do have to make certain commitments. And many, but not all, of the loans governments have committed to use these funds transparently, including South Africa, for example, where the IMF approved $4.3 billion. And the South African government committed to, for example, publishing procurement contracts, including the names of companies and the ownership information of companies awarded contracts. But as you noted, the question is what happens if they don't implement these commitments, or if the public simply is not able to hold governments accountable, either because they face retaliation or because the judiciary is unwilling to hold powerful people accountable. And that's where Human Rights Watch, among many other organizations, including Transparency International and others, have been pushing the IMF to use its considerable leverage, expertise, creativity to ensure that these funds are used accountably. Because even as this money has tremendous potential to do good, it actually also, if captured by wealthy interests, can actually fuel inequality.
All right, so the other side of this was the austerity programs. Now, the IMF, they have a bit of a reputation in terms of enforcing rules and structures that they think are best suited for the donee countries. And I just wonder, though, isn't this part of managing the funding? And that's why they're important.
Well, this is actually quite a mystery to me about why programs are still requiring fiscal targets that would force countries to impose austerity. According to an analysis by Eurodad, which is a debt-focused organization, the programs for 80 countries would require austerity by 2023. Now, this goes against everything the IMF itself has said it learned from the 2008 recession, and what the current managing director has been saying to governments, which is spend on social investment, and actually the rhetoric has been opposed to austerity, and we know that this is austerity not only is harmful to rights, but it does not work from an economic perspective. A report from the IMF chief economist following in the 2008 recession, I believe it was published in 2011, found that for every dollar governments cut from their budgets, the economy shrunk $1.50. So, austerity hurts. Austerity doesn't work. The IMF knows that and has been saying that, including with regard to this crisis, and yet its programs seem to be falling back on its default positions of imposing fiscal targets that would require austerity.
So what's the alternative then? How do you manage these funds, but not in an austere way?
Well, the answer is you invest the funds well. You invest the funds in people. You invest the funds in ensuring adequate social protection, in health, in education, in food, in housing. And when you have a kind of a bottom-up recovery and investing in people, that is the big lesson from 2008. Is that what works? It works for people and it works for economies. And what we are concerned about is that what we are seeing is that in many countries we are getting a repeat of 2008, where a lot of money is going out the door. Here's a tremendously alarming, not alarming, but astonishing figure that Kristalina Georgieva mentioned this morning, was that governments have spent $12 trillion on households and firms. Now, this is an enormous amount of money that could be going to help spur the economy, but it also can be captured by wealthy interests, which shrinks the economy and robs people of their rights in a situation of unprecedented global economic crisis.
All right. So, I guess sometimes it's difficult to put a face and on some of the issues that we're talking about. But what difference does it make on the lives of ordinary people on the ground to make sure that these funds get where they're meant to go and do what they're meant to do?
Honestly, I suspect that many of your viewers need only to look in the mirror around their dining room table to have the answer to that question. I mean, it's a question of, I live in the United States, it's a question of having access to affordable health care in the midst of a pandemic. It's the question of, what you're going to do when eviction moratoria are up and rent is due, people having utilities cut off, people whose income has been impaired and they don't know how they're going to feed their families. Huge costs that come from the pandemic around education and things like that. And so the difference isn't, it's one of these crises that the difference is really in all of our lives, and not just, and not a kind of a hidden minority.